All right, if you just joined, welcome to the Stormwater 101 webinar. Good afternoon, and I want to remind you that today's webinar is hosted by University of Illinois Extension. My name is Lisa Merrifield, and I'm a Community and Economic Development Specialist within Extension. For sound quality, we're muting microphones during the presentation. Use the chat space if you've got questions for the speakers, and if you have any problems connecting, add those questions to the chat space. I will monitor that space and pose any comments or questions to our speakers at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar is part of our Sustainable Communities series, and it is titled Stormwater 101, How to Address Community Flooding and Water Quality Issues. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our local government education website and our YouTube channel in the next couple days. Without further ado, our presenters today are Ileana Brown, who's a stormwater engineer with University of Illinois Extension, and Dr. Amy Ando, who's a professor of natural resource and economics at the University of Illinois. At this time, I will turn it over to our speakers. Ileana?
Thank you, Lisa. Let me get this to start here. There we go. Well, thank you for joining us today. Now, these are the things that I'm going to cover during my part. My goal is to provide a quick overview of stormwater management and define terms with the purpose of getting us all on the same page to set up Dr. Ando's talk. I'll also give you some resources at the end, and you'll receive a follow-up email with a list of those resources. So, if you signed up for this webinar, you're probably well aware of our state's problems with stormwater management. Flooding, of course, pictured here, and water quality, which will be in a few slides. According to the report for the Illinois Flooding Awareness Act, between the years of 2007 and 2014, there were at least 2.4 billion with a B in documented damages due to flooding. Of these, 1.2 billion were private claims, which typically represent basement flooding and sewer backups. Now, if you've ever had that happen at your own place, like I have, then you know how fraught it can be. Flooding in people's homes is emotionally charged. The house pictured here has 2 sump pumps and still takes on water during big storms. One of the more extreme cases I've heard of is another home which would typically have several feet of water, and the homeowner had to bolt her furnace to the ceiling. Now, does it flood everywhere in Illinois? The answer is yes. Flooding happens all over the state. With more people in the Chicago region, there are more instances there, but it does happen all over the state. Now here we see another problem, downstream water quality. According to the 2014 Illinois Integrated Water Quality Report, Illinois had more than 1,000 miles of streams and 40,000 acres of lakes impaired due to stormwater runoff. So now that I've probably depressed everyone, we're going to get to some solutions. Here's some of our solutions. We're going to first talk about conventional gray infrastructure. Storm drains are one solution to flooding problems. They treat water as a waste, as you probably know, and they can be very effective at moving stormwater runoff swiftly away to receiving streams. And one reason we get flooding is because many of our legacy storm sewers are undersized. Can you see the brick lining in this one? This is a photo from my old neighborhood. So this storm sewer was designed in the early 1900s for a 5-year storm. Switching back to water quality, this graph shows what the flow in the stream before we put in concrete and storm drains. And here's what happens to the flow when we have storm drains. The impact is a much quicker stream and it's more dramatic. And that's what causes our streams to look like this, that photo that I showed in the beginning, an eroded stream with altered geomorphology. And to add insult to injury, there's litter and other pollution that go directly into our receiving streams untreated. Stormwater basins can be a really great solution. They can help release runoff at a more acceptable rate. And this is a really lovely photo, but ponds don't always stay this nice. Ponds are not maintenance free. This one photo pictured here has insufficient bank stabilization, and there can be other issues. Ponds can bring in geese, and lots of geese can bring lots of you-know-what, which raises bacterial counts. On the right is a typical subdivision pond, which has not been very well maintained, has a myriad of issues, including sedimentation and algae. So it's helpful to have another kind of solution. And that's our next category, which is green stormwater infrastructure. Many of you are probably familiar with green infrastructure. Since the 1990s, there's been a greater interest in treating stormwater runoff as a resource rather than as a waste by using green stormwater infrastructure. I am a master gardener, and in our master gardener program, we learn that a weed is simply a plant out of place. In some ways, flooding is water out of place. An unwelcome flood in someone's basement would be an amenity if it were in a lake. Now, to be sure, we're not helping matters because we pave over our prairies and wetlands that would have soaked up all that water. But how can we do things differently? Green infrastructure is a way to reclaim our landscapes that infiltrate and can sometimes store water too. Now, before I show examples, I am going to have a disclaimer. Our huge 500-year storms, they would require more than going back to pre-development infiltration rates in order to prevent flooding, but green infrastructure is very helpful for 90% of our storms. So some of our types of green infrastructure. Here's a bioswale. It conveys stormwater at a slow rate and also infiltrates and cleans runoff. Probably heard of rain gardens. I like to show this photo because it's a rain garden that's in autumn. They can look nice year-round. Now they're similar to bioswales, but they don't usually convey water. Both bioswales and rain gardens typically have plants that thrive in times of drought or flood, and oftentimes those are native plants. Permeable pavement infiltrates runoff without the use of plants, but it has that functionality that we're able to drive on it, walk on it. Green roofs typically contain planting medium and vegetation on top of a waterproof membrane and support panels. They can also be very beneficial for regarding energy costs. Rain barrels and cisterns are closed containers that retain runoff for non-potable use. Rain barrels are typically 55 gallons. Cisterns are much larger. They can store thousands of gallons of runoff. Trees themselves are great at soaking up water. Stormwater tree trenches are a row of trees that are connected by an underground trench engineered with layers of gravel and soil to store runoff. I'm just going to add a note here that if you'd like to see ways of doing these green infrastructure practices really beautifully, I want to put a plug in for the October 4th talk from this series that was called Public Places in the 21st Century. I believe you can go to the website for the local government series and find a link for it there. Now, adding these practices together can increase the effectiveness. This next photo is a permeable parking lot that goes into a bioswale that then goes into the normal storm drain system. That's just two practices together. The next piece I want to show is the preserves at Oak Meadows, which won an ASLA award, and according to the website, which is shown there at the bottom, the preserves at Oak Meadows includes a new wetland habitat, a 1-mile stream bank restoration and stabilization, and a trail which connects to a nearby forest preserve. The preserve at Oak Meadows provides significant environmental benefit and access to a beautiful and revived Illinois landscape. I think this is a really interesting project because many of us may not be thinking of a golf course as a place that can provide environmental benefit, but this one does. It thinks of itself as not a golf course within a preserve, but a preserve project that has a golf course. And a nice example of agencies working together to have an amenity that's used by a lot of folks. So one thing I want to note regarding green infrastructure, well, all infrastructure, is that all infrastructure requires maintenance. Maintenance skills are different for gray infrastructure and for green infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers grade for the state of Illinois' overall infrastructure is a C-. Much of our infrastructure in stormwater management is underneath the ground, so we don't see it. So I want to put the thought out there that maybe we would do better at maintaining our infrastructure if it's more visible, like green infrastructure is. Going to the resource portion of my talk, if you are looking to train your workforce, Parkland College offers a nationally certified program, the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. If you would like more information about it, here's some contact information. They are having an inaugural class at the end of January. I also have a few other resources to share with you. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources wrote that report for urban flooding awareness, and in the back of that that report are a number of recommendations, and there are some that are specifically for local governments. I would urge you to take a look at that. One of those recommendations involves ordinances, and they developed a state model ordinance, and that is available at that link as well. The Illinois State Water Survey has a really wonderful website for their coordinated hazard assessment and mapping program. The Center for Neighborhood Technology has a program called Rain Ready that is a very helpful program. I reached out to them and they said that they would be happy to talk to any municipality, even nationwide, who would be interested in working with them. And of course, Extension, who I work with, has folks all over the state that can help. If you go to the link that I show there, there's a drop-down menu when you look under staff, and the folks that you want to look for are either in community and economic development, environmental and energy stewardship, and horticulture. More resources for you come from NOAA in their Office of Coastal Management. And there's a lot of really great information on these links regarding how green infrastructure can reduce flooding. And finally, our state's Association for Floodplain and Stormwater Management at illinoisfloods.org has a lot of information as well. Their annual conference is March 13th through 14th in East Peoria. One last thing to leave you with, or actually before I say this, if anyone listening in today has additional resources that they would like added to the list, you could please put those in the chat box. That'd be helpful, I think, for everyone. I do want to mention that a lot nationwide, many local governments use stormwater utilities to fund their stormwater projects. Illinois has 28 stormwater utilities, with an average fee being assessed of $5 per month. If you are interested in looking more about or looking into stormwater utility fees, the link at the bottom there of the screen is an annual survey that Western Kentucky University does, and they have a lot of information about stormwater utilities. I believe now they even are doing international survey. They have a few Canadian cities that are whose information is included in this as well. I think that's it for me. This is my contact information and a picture of my own personal rain garden. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Okay. I'll turn it over to Dr. Ando.
Okay, thank you very much, Eliana. That was a beautiful presentation. Let me get mine shared here. Let's see.
I think somebody just put something in the chat box asking about slides, and we can make those available. And Eliana will send out a list of resources that are available.
Let's see, screen. Working on it. Did that work?
We can see your whole screen.
Oh, how do I change that?
Is one of the Nancy, are you there?
Mm-hmm. And if you hit share at the bottom, it'll be the second row of choices where you can do the actual PowerPoint. And I think maybe you just did that.
Did that work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that once
we can see the PowerPoint.
You can see the PowerPoint now?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Once you hit slideshow, it'll, I think it will take up the whole screen.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Here we go.
Perfect.
Well, not too
there you
clumsy a handoff, Eliana. We need to work on our relay race here. Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm a teaching and research faculty member at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and it's really a pleasure and a privilege to get to be talking with people who are actually out doing the things that we talk about. So this is an overview of the things that I'm going to be discussing with you. First of all, Eliana did a great job of talking about what green infrastructure stormwater solutions are. I'm going to abbreviate that GSI for green stormwater infrastructure. But we're going to be talking about what are the fiscal benefits. So if you're a city, how could this be helping your financial situation? I'm also going to talk about what we understand about the other benefits of using GSI. And then finally, what policy tools could be used to induce greater adoption of GSI. And I will say, I'm not going to talk a lot about gray infrastructure, not because that shouldn't continue to be part of cities' stormwater solutions, but just because we're already doing that. And so the big question is, how do we change things so that we do other things as well? Okay, so the first set of fiscal rewards of GSI is actually lower costs. So research finds that GSI is often less costly than conventional approaches to dealing with stormwater. It can reduce gray infrastructure capital costs up front. And of course, there are capital costs to green infrastructure, but those are often lower. And it also reduces the flow of annual costs associated with dealing with stormwater. Wastewater pumping and treatment is a big cost savings. Some kinds of green infrastructure can reduce energy use, and other kinds can reduce use of road salt. One example, a case study in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, showed that you could cut capital costs by $120 million and cut annual wastewater pumping and treatment costs by $661,000 every year. So this is significant. And then there's other work that surveyed 13 case studies, and in all of them found that broader implementation of green stormwater solutions would, in fact, save money. People have found that it's especially cost-effective if we integrate green infrastructure installation into your regular maintenance cycle. So rather than marching down and sort of proactively digging things up and so forth, just as things need repairing, then you take that opportunity to convert it to green infrastructure. It's also more cost effective if you exploit economies of scale. So rather than having lots of little tiny rain gardens or very small rain barrels, having larger bioswales, larger elements in your community can be more cost effective. Cost effectiveness. So these are annual maintenance costs, and I put this here because this study points out that it's important. Maintenance costs are also a part of it, as Eliana mentioned. It's important to look at maintenance costs in terms of dollars per acre of impervious area managed. That if you look at it in terms of dollars per area of the green infrastructure, you get very different numbers, and that's not really the number that you want. It's worth, of course, some things have more maintenance costs than others, but this wouldn't be the only thing that you look at when you're thinking about which tools you want to use. You would want to look at installation costs, maintenance costs, but also the benefits. Let's see, did I skip something? No, we're good. So another fiscal reward of green stormwater infrastructure is that you could increase tax revenue. So there's research indicating that green stormwater infrastructure can increase property values. And of course, it depends on exactly what you're using, but some green stormwater infrastructure approaches yield developments with more open space, and property values tend to be higher when homes are near open space. If you are successful in reducing flooding, that also increases property values. And I'm so glad that Eliana went first. As you can see, that done well, a lot of green stormwater infrastructure can be quite beautiful. And so the aesthetics can increase property values. The result is higher tax revenue. And so one example from the city of Philadelphia, they estimated that proximity to green stormwater infrastructure was leading to 10% higher home values of properties that were close to those things. So of about, if you took into account the 500 green stormwater infrastructure projects that they had seen implemented, that was yielding $1.3 billion more value in homes, which led to $18 million more dollars in tax revenue every year. So I know my community could benefit from higher tax revenue. There are other fiscal rewards from green stormwater infrastructure. There's also private value. So there are, this is a nice little thing, I think, put together by the NRDC. Especially on large private commercial property, there can be pretty significant private value. Green rooftops have been shown repeatedly to be privately beneficial. You save energy, lower maintenance costs. They don't have to be replaced as often. And there was a study showing here that there was a rental premium that people were able to charge more for rental units in a building with a green rooftop. Landscaping with rain gardens and bioswales, again, can increase rental rates for office buildings. There's some indication that if you are able to meet like something like the LEED eco label or something, then that can increase occupancy rates and rents in office buildings. And tree cover. Trees are an interesting form of green infrastructure. They reduce energy demand in buildings for heating and cooling. Once they're tall enough, when they're just saplings, they don't do much. But if you're planting trees with significant canopy cover, then that reduces energy use. Rain barrels and cisterns save on water bills in places where you're actually charging for water. And where there's permeable pavement, then there's some indication that that has lower maintenance costs than traditional. So that's all money, and everybody thinks economists are all about money, but I'm an environmental economist, and environmental economists study things that aren't financial. So there are other benefits. Green stormwater infrastructure can produce many kinds of benefits. Here's a boring old list. I've put in gray the sorts of things that we've already talked about, saving water treatment needs, gray infrastructure needs, salt use, and energy use. But there are a lot of other things that aren't necessarily easily measured with dollars. Improved water quality, reduced flooding, more water supply, better air quality, reduced urban heat island. So there's a wide range of things that can benefit a community from using green stormwater infrastructure instead of only using gray stormwater infrastructure. This is a nice little thing that was put together. Eliana mentioned the Center for Neighborhood Technology. This is from a big report that they did on the estimating the benefits of green infrastructure. And it just kind of shows how different kinds of green stormwater infrastructure can yield different kinds of benefits. So most things don't increase available water supply, but water harvesting with cisterns do. And you could actually have a great big cistern and use that to water your outdoor landscaping instead of paying a high water bill. Permeable pavement does a lot of things for reducing runoff, but it doesn't do much for these things over here, urban agriculture and so forth. The things with tree planting and green roofs, those have more sort of habitat and community benefits. So there are trade-offs when you're sitting down and deciding what you want your stormwater solution strategy to be. You're thinking not just about what mixture of gray and green infrastructure do we want to incentivize in our community, but also within the category of green infrastructure, which of these different kinds of benefits are likely to be most important to us? Are we in a place where water is expensive and so water harvesting is going to be really important? Or are we in a community where some of the benefits of having trees and bioretention and filtration, that's basically rain gardens and bioswales, are those benefits important to us? And so there's a lot of flexibility and ability to tailor designs and policies to the needs and desires of your particular community. So let me back up. How do you think about this though, right? So maybe you have better habitat or better air quality or better water quality. How do you decide how important that is? How do you weigh that against the costs of implementing these things? Well, we can actually estimate the dollar values of a lot of these less tangible benefits of green stormwater infrastructure, and economists have been working on this for a while. There's a very small set of us who work on this stuff. Down here I'm mentioning a paper that I wrote with a colleague of mine out in Portland, Oregon, Noella Netasil. She's at Reed College. And this here is a survey that we just wrote of some of the estimates of the dollar benefits of green stormwater infrastructure. So some of this work has been done, and even if it hasn't been done in your community, you can probably, especially if you can find an economist to help you sort of do a little bit of translation, use that to help you at least get some ballpark estimates of what the benefits might be in your community. These kinds of numbers allow us to do benefit cost analysis. It helps you with the design of policies that I'm going to talk about later, like taxes and subsidies. And it helps urban managers to choose designs and investments that maximize the benefits to your own communities when there are trade-offs between different kinds of benefits. So the most common approach to this sort of valuation is one where people like Eliana, scientists, estimate the physical impacts of an investment or policy. So if you have green roofs or bioswales, what does that give you in terms of reduced flooding, improved water quality, lower energy use, any one of those things? And then economists use what we call valuation research monetize those changes. Now, I've provided here a link. This is something that was produced by the Center for Neighborhood Technology around the same time as that report that I mentioned. That was a pretty big effort in 2010, 2011. I was one of the people who took part in the workshop that they had, where they brought together a lot of people to think about this problem of how do we estimate the benefits of different kinds of green infrastructure. And then they produced a big report, and then they also created a calculator. The link I have here is to the national version of their calculator that's relevant to lots of different communities across the country. They also have a calculator that's really kind of just for Illinois. And I tried to figure out how to embed this in my presentation, but I'm not that good at technology. But you can go to it and enter in a site and enter in features of the site and what kinds of green infrastructure you might use, and it will estimate changes in physical outcomes and then provide estimates of costs and benefits. So it's sort of an interesting thing. I don't know how much they have kept it, I don't know how much they've updated it, or how much the values are likely to have changed in the time since they developed it. But it seems like it would be a useful place to start. Another thing you can do, if you want to do something really like, what about my community? I really want to know what's going on here. What I'm showing you here is an example of an original research project that a graduate student and I did right here in Champaign-Urbana with a budget of $0, except for the beer incentives that we provided to her friends to help actually carry the survey. So this was a survey, and they distributed it by dropping the surveys off at people's homes and then picking them up a couple days later. And it's a kind of research that we call choice experiments. So in a choice experiment, this is an example of a question that you pose to people. So you have pages before explaining what these things are, what we mean by floods, what does water quality mean, what's fishable, what's swimmable, why would you care about water infiltration? We explained that improves aquatic habitat and reduces some of those problems that Eliana talked about. So we explained all these things, and then we said, all right, well, suppose here on the right, there's your current situation. You could pay nothing, and we'll just stick with that. But suppose you had option A or option B with changes in flooding and water quality and a little bit of money that you'd have to pay. Would you prefer one of those to the current situation? And so you ask these questions. So you survey people and you ask them what their preferences are. And by analyzing the data about these choices that people make, it allows us to get estimates of the value that they have for each of those individual attributes. And so these are the kinds of dollar values that we could estimate based on analyzing those data. So this is for the total value for all the households in Champaign-Urbana, which isn't a huge community. So reducing basement flooding by 25% would yield total value of about $600,000. Improving infiltration, also about $600,000. People in this community were very excited about improving water quality. And so forth. And so you can also get a sense of trade-off. So it's possible to do something with your stormwater so you reduce flooding, but if you did a lot of gray infrastructure, that could decrease water quality, and then the net effect could actually be negative, because while people like reduced flooding, they don't like decreased water quality, and at least in our community, the harm done by decreasing water quality outweighed the benefits of the reduced flooding. So that is something that can be done. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you that there are some pretty significant benefits to green stormwater infrastructure. And I don't say that because I personally care about it. Like, this is the research. But the question is, how do we then design policy tools for green stormwater infrastructure to accomplish to sort of be able to take advantage of some of those benefits. There's this problem we have in environmental things in general, that we have externalities. So maybe Eliana and I are neighbors, and I pave over my entire backyard, and she then has a flooded basement because of my runoff. So that's an externality, and whenever we have externalities, we end up with too much of a harmful thing. Eliana has a beautiful rain garden, and that is contributing to the public good of improved hydrology in her community. But she doesn't bear all of those benefits. Other people do too. And when we have public goods, we have free riding and too little of that good thing being produced. So how can we achieve a better outcome? I'm going to talk about a couple of different types of strategies: individual action, codes and regulations, subsidies, and finally taxes, or I think I'm calling them fees, and tradable allowances. So individual action, you know, sometimes the cost of an environmental improvement is negative. So we saw in a couple of cases, you know, green roofs, actually sometimes the private benefits outweigh the private costs. You don't even need to care about your community and the environment and flooding. And so in some cases, education alone can lead to change. And so there's a conversation in the literature about green stormwater infrastructure about how it would help to reduce the uncertainty that people have about what the outcomes will be and what the costs will be. So the work that Extension is doing to try to communicate more knowledge, develop and communicate more knowledge is helpful. We can provide technical support. So some of the kinds of resources that Eliana was talking about, technical support for GSI design. If your community has never done this before, it can be hard to get started. And so having people there to get you started and to help you with some of those initial designs can be really helpful. And then one thing I've noticed is you know, this isn't private action, but you know, the city, if your city staff has been doing stormwater management with gray infrastructure forever, and if all your contractors know how to lay down regular concrete, but they haven't developed the skills and the knowledge for using permeable concrete, providing training, so that then you have your city staff knows how to use this other approach to green stormwater infrastructure, and your contractors, you've got more contractors in your area that have those skills, that can also break through this inertia of adopting the new technology. And then finally, I think it's possible that marketing could help those commercial property owners to benefit from those price premiums that I mentioned. I'm not exactly sure what cities and communities can do, but it would be interesting to explore whether there's something they could do to promote eco-labeling, to raise awareness of it, or even to help with marketing themselves. Okay, so that is all non-coercive at all. And I think a lot can be accomplished that way. However, when you have externalities, sometimes you just need to tell people to do something. So there are regulatory sticks out there. And these are not uncommon in communities across the country. So for example, the city of Chicago has a building code that builders have to design new projects to manage the first 1 inch of rain on site. And you could have something in your code that says that developers have to leave a certain fraction of their land undisturbed. So you could just have rules. And you could have a rule that says, was it France that recently had a rule that new roofs have to all have something green on them, either a green roof or solar panels or something? So you could just force people to change the way that they develop. There are some advantages of this. It's simple. It's just a rule. You check to see if they have designed the property and met the rule, and then you're done. You don't have continuing enforcement costs. It's pretty easy to enforce and communicate. And you can borrow templates from other places. So those are real advantages. But the drawback is that these kinds of approaches are not usually the cheapest way to do things across a whole community when the costs and benefits of green stormwater infrastructure vary. So maybe Eliana and we have different properties and different uses. And so perhaps the cost to Eliana of using green infrastructure is very low. She's a gardener and you know, maybe doesn't have a high value for other uses of her yard. I'm not a gardener. I kill most of the plants in my yard, and maybe I have kids who want to play soccer. And so the opportunity cost to me of having a lot of my yard taken up by a rain garden would be very high. So in cases like that, where the costs of implementation vary across sites, it's not actually cost effective to force everybody to do the same thing. It would be better if, you know, Eliana did a little bit more green infrastructure and I did a little bit less. And so the trick is to figure out ways to do that that aren't too burdensome for a city manager and that are fair and transparent. Fortunately, there are ways to do this. So the one you've probably seen the most is just using subsidies. So if we subsidize green infrastructure, and this can be done either with direct payments, cost sharing of installation or something, or with property tax credits, you're going to get uptake where the costs are lowest. So Eliana is going to look at that subsidy and say, wow, you know, it's already not that expensive for me to do green infrastructure, and here's this subsidy. I am going to take advantage of that. I'm going to look at that subsidy and I'm going to say, there's no way you could not pay me enough. I'm not going to do it. And that's appropriate. Then we get the outcome we wanted. She does more, I do less. It's cost effective. The other advantage, frankly, from a city's point of view, is that it's popular. People like subsidies. Everybody likes getting money. The problem is that you have to pay them money, and cities don't always have that much money sitting around that they can spend on green infrastructure. And then you also have to figure out how large that subsidy should be, and that isn't always immediately obvious. And so it might be helpful to reach out to your friendly local neighborhood economist who's at a land-grant university and have a conversation about that. The flip side of a subsidy is a fee. And I'm going to call this, when economists talk about fees, we mean something different than the stormwater utility fee that Eliana was mentioning. So you could have a fee on impervious surface, or you could have a fixed number of allowances for impervious surface, but you let people trade them for money. So the city of Philadelphia now has an impervious surface tax. Actually, so do Champaign and Urbana. Alternatively, you could say, all right, everybody gets a certain number of square feet of impervious surface that they can have. And if you want to cover up more, then you have to buy allowances from other people. Those approaches will also give you a cost-effective allocation of green stormwater infrastructure across properties. You'll still get the most improvement where it's cheapest. It's expensive for me, I'm going to pay the tax. Eliana, it's cheap for her, so she's going to do lots of green stormwater infrastructure and not pay the tax. Again, we're getting the most improvement where it's cheapest, and that's good. The good thing is that if you design this properly, it can give you incentives both to use green stormwater infrastructure and to reduce the total footprint of your development. And it doesn't have budget outlays. You're not spending any money, you the city, in order to get this done. Nobody likes to pay taxes or fees. That often gets community pushback. The nice thing about tradable allowances is that you could give everybody a set of allowances that they're allowed for free. So you have less opposition. And then if you want to have more pavement in your backyard, then you have to buy more allowances from your neighbors. But it seems less burdensome to people and will have less opposition. Now, challenges to this, you have to measure impervious surface and the changes in it. You need to set up a mechanism for trading those allowances. You need to do some thinking to pick the right level of the fee or the right number of allowances to distribute. And I put this in bold because this is important. You want to make sure that you provide incentives for abatement of existing impervious surface. So just charging people for their existing impervious surface, that doesn't provide any incentives. You need it to be possible for people to say, hey, look, I retrofitted my driveway and now it's got pervious concrete. Give me my lower fee. If you do that, then you're providing incentives for retrofits, and that can be really valuable. So I want to put in a plug for that, because I think that there are a lot of communities that have stormwater taxes or fees, but they're not doing this thing where people can get have incentives for abatement. Okay, so to conclude, because I wanted to leave some time for people to ask questions, green stormwater infrastructure can save money, can reduce both capital and annual costs of managing stormwater and increase tax revenues. It can have many other environmental benefits that have significant value. Finally, how do you get this done? Well, there's lots of tools available to you. You can incentivize it with subsidies, with taxes, or with tradable permits. Those latter things can be very cost effective and a little bit more flexible than a one-size-fits-all building code that requires people to install certain amounts of green stormwater infrastructure. So thank you for having me. That's my contact information, just amyando@illinois.edu. And I have this, and presumably Eliana and Nancy can, Nancy and Lisa can distribute this to people later. Should I stop sharing now? Let you guys have the screen?
Actually, why don't you leave that up just so people can jot down notes.
Okay.
If anybody's got questions, please add them in the chat box. Thank you both so much for your presentations. And hopefully we're going to get some questions coming in.
I'm new to this. I have to figure out how to get my chat box back.
All right, we did get one question. Let's see. Typically, how are new policies about pavement options introduced in communities? So how would a community go about doing that?
Oh,
that might be a hard one.
Yeah. Presumably, you would need to have a. Anytime you have a new policy, it is important to have community involvement in the conversation about what that's going to look like. Having community meetings to share some of this information about why you're doing this, and then the pros and cons and resources, so that people understand that this is not a totally ridiculous, unreasonable thing you're proposing. If you've never heard of permeable concrete, it might seem crazy to people, and I think that in order to make the policy make sure in your community, you really do want to understand what the preferences are in your community, not just what I told you the averages are. So how do people feel about the trade-offs associated with some of these things? I will say, so a little case study in our town. There's a park in my neighborhood, and the park district wanted to do something extremely controversial and pave a path down the middle of it that used to be a wood chip path, and very unpopular, but they did it with permeable concrete, and it's lovely and it works beautifully. So it could be that some demonstration projects would help with communicating and having that conversation.
Okay, thank you. Second question came in, or comment. This person says, I'm not sure that increasing property tax assessments for homes near green infrastructure is a good selling point. Further, that would be tax money drawn for other uses, or perhaps better ones. So it's not entirely clear that that's a net benefit.
Well, of course, you wouldn't have to increase your property tax assessments. People's houses would be worth more. If you wanted to respond to that, if your city wanted to respond to that by lowering the tax rate, they could certainly do that. But it doesn't. It increases the base of value available for property tax.
All right, that makes sense. This might be a question for Ann Silvas or Nancy Adrago. Are there facilitators that can help communities go through this visioning process? And, oops, you're asking questions fast and my screen's popping, and get an analysis of the value of the community in Chicago? Actually, Eliana, you might be able to answer this too. Facilitators in Chicago?
Hey, let's see, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yep.
Well, is this, I believe this is part of, if you looked at that drop-down screen of staff and find a community and economic development person in the Chicago region, they could potentially help be a facilitator to do that. Is that the right answer, Lisa?
Well, it's a possible answer. Extension does help have services to help communities do plans, but we're a fairly limited sized staff. You know, in Chicago, I wonder if the Mayor's Caucus might have some resources, or if the Center for Neighborhood Technology or Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. That's an interesting question, but I bet there are, in addition to Extension, other people who do this kind of thing and would help communities. So maybe we need to follow up and think that one through a little bit further. All right, moving on. Another question, is permeable concrete available in most areas of the country? I'd never heard of that before.
Yes, it is. And a lot of the, I'm going to give you kind of a follow-up question that maybe you didn't ask, but some people might be thinking of. You know, if you have permeable concrete in a southern state and it doesn't have a freeze-thaw cycle, that's going to be different than, say, in our northern states. The University of New Hampshire has a training site that looks at, and they've been doing this for a while, looks at permeable concrete and how it works in colder parts of the country. And there are, of course, lots of permeable concrete throughout the Midwest, and if you go to the Northwest, I've seen a lot of it there as well. So yes, it's everywhere, and there's need everywhere. So thankfully, it does seem to work well in a lot of different climates.
Somebody else posted a thought about, does permeable pavement cause any issues with accessibility for wheelchairs or strollers?
That's a really good question. I think you have to keep that in mind during the design so that things are ADA compliant.
I've seen permeable pavement though, and I see wheelchairs and strollers on it, so at least anecdotally, I don't think it's a big problem.
Okay. Let's see. The idea of installing a system of check dams on smaller drainage or urban tributary streams, has the idea of installing check dams or smaller drainage on urban tributary streams ever been employed? And if so, would that be a cost-effective mechanism?
Eliana, do you know what that is?
Well, I believe the purpose of that is to slow things down. That issue that I was talking about with the things being real quick. I can't give you specific case studies of where that's been done. I have heard of it being talked about. So, and whether it's a cost-effective investment, I can't answer that. So I believe they've been employed, but I don't know enough additional information on how that has been working. But I'm going to look into that now. That's a great question.
All right, great. And Cheryl Watson, yes, I will follow up with you. One final question. Eliana, you had beautiful pictures with beautiful plants. Can you get those at your garden center? Are there places that, you know, for those of us who want to experiment with doing some of this in our yard? How do we start?
That's a great question. So you can get them at many local nurseries, and there's also a really nice list of native plant nurseries that I can add to the resource list, but that's at the website for Illinois Native Plant Society. There are a lot of there are some native plant organizations that are nonprofits that have usually like one sale a year. I try to hit those because they are very careful in making sure to gather those plants ethically, and the money goes towards conservation efforts.
Great. All right, I think that's the list of our questions. Thank you so much. I believe Nancy is going to put up a poll question here very quickly for those of you who are on to answer. And when you see that, if you take a second to fill that out, that really helps us in gauging how well we did. And I want to thank you for participating today. The video recording will be available on the local government education website within 2 to 3 business days. And we hope that all of you will be able to join us after the new year. We're going to do 2 legislative updates. First, a state legislative update on Thursday, January 17th, and then a federal legislative update the following Thursday, January 24th. And information on those webinars will come out in your follow-up email. All right. Again, thank you so much. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Eliana.
It was a
this
pleasure.
was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.